pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. It's really quite a challenge to talk about such a visual subject as synesthesia without the benefit of PowerPoint slides, and a lot of them. But since we're in the gallery here, I will have to paint pictures with words. This whole exhibit is a tribute to the phenomenon of synesthesia, which I know is unfamiliar to most of you. But all of you know the word anesthesia, meaning no sensation. So sharing the same root, synesthesia means joint sensation, such that my voice, for example, is not only something that you hear, but you also see it or taste it or feel it as a touch. As children, synesthetes are shocked to discover that the rest of the world isn't like them. And we once thought it was a very rare phenomenon, but now we know that synesthesia affects the brain wiring of 1 in every couple hundred people, including some famous artists in this exhibit. First off, however, there is some confusion about the term synesthesia, because over its 300-year history, it's been applied to wildly disparate things, from the perceptual phenomenon to poetry and metaphor, to deliberately contrived mixed media applications such as Sonu Lumiere and Odorama. So first, and this exhibit unfortunately doesn't distinguish between that, and it also uses the much less used British spelling of synesthesia, A-E. So for the science, if you Google for the science, it's just synesthesia. So we have to separate artists who used synesthesia as an intellectual idea of sensory fusion. Artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and her music Pink and Blue and the Green music. Separate her from those who had the genuine perceptual phenomenon, such as Kandinsky. Now, you may wonder how I got to be the authority on such an arcane topic, and the answer is by accident. 25 years ago, my dinner host delayed our seating with the apology that there weren't enough points on the chicken. And Michael Watson, who is the man who tasted shapes of that book's title, felt taste as a physical touch in his hands and on his face. And he said, with an intense flavor, a feeling sweeps down my arm and I feel weight, shape, texture, and temperature as if I'm actually grasping something. And he wanted the chicken to be a prickly, pointed shape, and it had come out all round. So I asked him a few more questions and then made my diagnosis. As I said, "Oh, you've got synesthesia." And his response was, "You mean there's a name for what I do?" You see, nobody in my academic circle had ever heard of synesthesia. And science had lost interest in it for many, many decades because it couldn't explain it. I only knew the word because I had read an obscure book called The Mind of a Mnemonist, which described a memory expert who could retain limitless amounts thanks to a 5-fold synesthesia in all of his senses. Now, my neurology colleagues joked that Michael Watson had to be on drugs, and they warned me to stay away because it was too new age, too weird, and it would ruin my career. You see, they had the typical reaction of orthodoxy to something that it can't explain, which is to shove it under the carpet. But then there was a paradigm shift, and now scientists in 15 countries are writing PhD theses and scholarly books about synesthesia. But for the longest time, mainstream science just rolled its eyes, and in trying to explain away the most common type of synesthesia, which is seeing letters and numbers in color, they argued that synesthetes were just remembering childhood associations from coloring books or refrigerator magnets, and that's why A was red or D was green, for example. But synesthesia runs strongly in families, a fact that Sir Francis Galton noted over a century ago, and it's also much more common in women. So how could it be childhood memories unless mothers were passing down the same magnets? Now, parenthetically, synesthetic associations are idiosyncratic, meaning that even two people in the same family, or even identical twins, will see different colors. So right off we have a discrepancy between the neurologic reality and the artistic ideal of sensory fusions, universal correspondences among the senses that apply to everybody. Well, what Galton noted astutely over a century ago is that otherwise normal people saw color whenever they looked at letters and numbers. In other words, the visual appearance of the written grapheme triggers a response of color. Now, on the other hand, the sound of language, or what are called phonemes, are more likely to trigger synesthetic tastes. So that one synesthete, for example, the word village tastes like sausage, as do other words with the same idge sound, like college and message. Derek tastes like earwax, and Philip like lightly buttered toast. So it turns out that phonemes triggering taste tend to be present in the word for that taste. So thus Sydney tastes like kidney, and Cincinnati like cinnamon. So childhood food terms act as templates for other words that trigger synesthesia. And once a link is established, it stays permanent and stable for life. So A is always red. Derek always tastes like earwax. What's fascinating is that synesthesia is genetically inherited, meaning it's biological, but it also requires early life exposure to culturally learned artifacts like letters, numbers, and food categories. In fact, permanent links get established between different kinds of sensation and a whole range of categories as shown by the wide variety of synesthetic types, because what the gene confers is hyperconnectivity between brain areas. Now, in the case of colored hearing, the grapheme recognition area on the left fusiform gyrus sits adjacent to the color area called V4, which gets activated by the visual appearance of the letter. And despite having normal color vision, synesthetes say that they see strange or weird colors that they wouldn't pick deliberately. A colorblind synesthete speaks of seeing Martian colors. You see, his retinal pigments are abnormal, but V4 is intact, and that gets driven by non-optical inputs. So that again argues against childhood memories, because how could you remember colors that you've never seen or that you're incapable of seeing? So that's the most common type of synesthesia. More relevant to tonight's exhibit is the second most common type of synesthesia, colored hearing. And that's the activation of color, shape, and movement by sound, by everyday environmental sounds, by voices, and especially by music, hence the title of the exhibit, Visual Music. Imagine an experience like fireworks, colored shapes that arise, they move a little bit, and they fade away. And they're replaced by another, and another, and another, in a kaleidoscopic montage, so long as the sound is persisting. Now, both Clay and Kandinsky trained as professional musicians, and they claimed that music made them see things. But before I get to them, let me deal with the skeptic's final criticism, which is that synesthetes are just being metaphoric, no different than saying loud tie or sharp cheese. But think a minute. Cheese isn't sharp, it's physically soft. And why use a touch adjective to describe a taste sensation? Or a taste term to describe a person, as in, she's really sweet. I mean, there's a circularity in saying that synesthesia is just metaphoric, because we don't understand how metaphor is represented in the brain. Rather, turn the argument on its head, and perhaps understanding the concrete physical sensation of synesthesia can help us get a neurologic handle on the basis, a handle on the neurologic basis of metaphor and perhaps even creativity. Now, I know that's going to send some of the curators here into apoplexy. I mean, how dare science try to penetrate the mystery of art? But I don't think there's a danger there. Well, I said we had to distinguish between the idea of sensory fusion and the genuine perceptual phenomenon that occurs in the absence of any external cause, like LSD, or a brain abnormality like epilepsy, which triggers synesthesia in about 4% of cases. And years ago, I proposed 5 features to do exactly that. First of all, you don't do anything. Synesthesia happens to you. So first, it's involuntary and automatic. And it's easy to show that by what's called perceptual grouping. If I show you a matrix of 5s and then tell you that hidden within it is a shape outlined by 2s, it'll take you a while to search and find it. But synesthetes, who see 2s as differently colored than 5s, very quickly say, oh, there's a red triangle, or whatever the shape happens to be, because perceptually similar items group together and pop out. Now, another way to show automaticity is through what's called masking. Now, normally you can still make out a number if I flash it to your peripheral vision. But if I then surround it with other numbers and crowd it, it becomes invisible. That's called masking. Remarkably, in synesthetes, it still evokes the color, even though they can't consciously make out what the number is. Rather, they deduce, well, it must be a 7 because I'm seeing a patch of green. And this tells us that synesthesia occurs very early in perception, perhaps before we're even consciously aware of seeing a stimulus at all. So, second, synesthesia is spatially extended. That is, they speak of going to or looking at a certain location to attend to what it is they see. Sometimes the spatial extension is literally outside the body. Michael Watson often spoke of reaching out at arm's length to palpate the taste that he felt. Whereas another woman with colored hearing speaks of a little screen about 6 inches in front of her eyes in which music makes colored lines play out. Third, synesthesia is durable, meaning that it's consistent over time, and it's generic, meaning that what they see is not pictorial and elaborated, but simple and elementary. Fourth, it's highly memorable, which I've already alluded to. And in fact, when you say, well, what good does synesthesia do? Why bother seeing colors? And the answer universally is, well, it helps you remember things. And lastly, it's loaded with affect, usually very pleasant. Synesthetes absolutely gush over the most trivial tasks, such as remembering a phone number or somebody's name, calling it gorgeous and delightful. The one woman whose name is Jean hates it. She never calls herself Jean because it's an ugly color. She calls herself Alexandra because A is the most beautiful red she's ever seen, and she just loves calling herself Alexandra. Now, on the other hand, mismatch perception, like seeing a letter printed in the wrong color ink, is like fingernails on a blackboard. So these 5 features define synesthesia's perceptual reality, along with a 40% likelihood that you'll have, if you've got one type of synesthesia, you'll have a second and third type, and by its strong heritability as an X-linked dominant trait. All right. Now, what's going on in these people's brains? Well, I mentioned the color area, V4. And doesn't it stand to reason that if they are claiming to see color, that V4 ought to activate? And it does. In fact, numerous experiments show cross-activation of brain areas given a stimulus and a synesthetic response. So then the question becomes, well, how might such a cross-activation come about? And here the newborn helps us out. The fetus makes 2 million synapses a second. That's a second, giving newborns an excess of working connections among brain areas. These are then pruned away to leave the modular organization that we know of in adults. So the so-called neonatal hypothesis says that inheriting a genetic mutation causes insufficient pruning between brain areas that normally would have been eliminated by synaptic competition early in life. So what the gene mutation is doing is conferring hyperconnectivity wherever it's expressed in the brain. So if 40% of individuals have a second or third type, that means that they've got the gene expressed in 2 or 3 different areas. But suppose this hyperconnectivity gene were expressed not selectively here and there, but diffusely in somebody's brain. Then you get somebody with a generalized hyperconnectivity and the ability to link seemingly disparate things. And that's the definition of metaphor, isn't it? Seeing the similar in the dissimilar. Now, it's long been known that synesthesia is much more common in creative people, such as artists and composers. Some famous synesthetes include Vladimir Nabokov, who had it in 3 generations of his family, the composers Olivier Messiaen and Amy Beach, and the artist David Hockney, who I've examined and have written about. Now, because they're used to mapping one concept to another in very unconventional ways, it stands to reason that they'd be more creative in other aspects of their lives. They're more open to novel experience. They're less constrained by rules than the rest of us are. Now, Kandinsky, he wrote a great deal to indicate that he had perceptual synesthesia. Listening to Wagner's Lohengrin, he said, "I saw all my colors in my mind. They stood before me. Wild, crazy lines sketched themselves before me." Well, wild, crazy lines would easily describe Kandinsky's own canvases. He had 4 synesthetic senses. He had color, sound, smell, and touch. He said that color had touch and texture, calling orange a prickly color, whereas dark ultramarine was smooth and felt like velvet. Color also had a unique smell, and he said, you know, there's a common expression, the scent of color, which I don't think anybody thinks is common, but it tells you something about what's going on in his mind. And lastly, he equated color with unique sounds, which he had elaborated on in his book on the spiritual in art. Later on, he equated color with Schoenberg's 12-tone music. So what Kandinsky did was to gradually intellectualize synesthesia. He made it abstract, and he hoped to find universal correspondences among the senses that would apply to everybody. Except now we know that it doesn't work that way, that synesthetic associations are idiosyncratic. They're unique to every individual. Now, compared to Kandinsky, Klee, if he was synesthetic, and the evidence for him is very meager, so I don't want to overstate the case, Klee stuck to the more immediate and sensuous aspects of his perceptions. He said, color possesses me. I don't have to pursue it. It will possess me always. I know it. He says, one day I must be able to improvise on the keyboard of color, the row of watercolors in my paint box. Now, again, he was a violinist, he trained as a musician, and at the Bauhaus, he studied relationships and similarities between auditory and visual rhythms, often using the term polyphonic, meaning many-voiced, in his painting titles to convey the sounds that he says he created sounds by layering color, line, and shape on one another. And to quote him, he said, the simultaneity of distinct themes is not something that's unique to music. Well, if you look at both Kandinsky and Klee's canvases, I think you'll discern in them what neuropsychology calls the form constants, or the possible building blocks of perception. What are these? Well, starting in 1930, the psychologist Heinrich Kluwer wanted to understand the experience of visual hallucinations. But he quickly discovered that the subjects were overwhelmed and awed by the indescribableness of what they were seeing, and that they quickly yielded to cosmic interpretations instead of straightforward descriptions of what they were seeing. But once Kluwer got them to hone it down to the bare essentials, he discovered 4 basic kinds of sensory configurations that he called grids, tunnels and cones, grids and cross-hatchings, central radiations, and spirals. And there are the form constants. And this is why I said that when listening to music, synesthetes don't see a pastoral landscape with sheep gambling through it. They see geometric shapes, zigzags, grids, blobs, angular forms. It's why Michael Watson's tasted shapes were largely geometric. It's why you can see the big spiral configuration in the large kupka behind you. And especially you'll see the form constants in the films because they're dynamic. They move and blend into one another in a kaleidoscopic kind of melange. What's fascinating is that you've got a scientist coming at it from one point of view asking, what are the essentials of perceptual configuration? And you've got artists coming at it from another direction entirely, and you end up with very similar forms. Okay, I've talked about synesthesia's perceptual reality and its underlying mechanism of hyperconnectivity, but I haven't yet said the so what, which is that all of us are synesthetic, except the majority of us are unconscious about the sensory fusions going on in our brain all the time. Now, why do I say this? Well, when we use metaphors like loud tie or sweet person, we don't mean that if we lick them like an ice cream cone, they taste sweet. We mean that they're pleasant and agreeable the way that sweets are. Now, a schizophrenic will interpret that metaphor literally, concretely, but the rest of us have no trouble understanding what it means. Why is that? Well, it turns out that for both synesthetes and non-synesthetes alike, there are lawful and regular relationships among the senses. So that, for example, we say that a loud tone is brighter than a soft tone, and that a high tone is smaller than a low tone, and that low tones are both larger and darker than high ones. Even smell maps to high, low, and bright, dark dimensions, and the relationship between color, odor, and intensity is very well known to sensory psychologists as well as to good chefs. So that, for example, we say that a darkly tinted liquid smells stronger than when it's pale, and it tastes stronger too. And when white wine is surreptitiously colored red, it suddenly smells like red wine. Now, because sight, sound, and movement map to one another so closely, even bad ventriloquists can convince us that whatever's moving is doing the talking. Dance is another example of cross-sensory mapping in which body rhythms mimic sound rhythms, both visually and kinetically. Now I want you to consider the following. When speakers of various tongues are shown two shapes, one that looks like a shard of broken glass and the other one like an amoeba blob, and told that in alien Martian language, one of these is called Buba and the other one is called Kiki. 98% of the individuals picked the jagged shape as Kiki because its visual spikes mimic the Kiki sound and the sharp motor inflection against the palate, whereas the blob's visual contours are more like the auditory and motor inflections of Buba. And this illustrates a general principle in biology that pre-existing analogs are often co-opted, so that synesthetic associations our ancestors made long ago have grown into the more abstract kinds of language that we understand today, and that's why metaphors make sense. Lawful relations among the senses suggest a cognitive continuum, as perceptual similarities give way to synesthetic equivalences, which go into metaphoric identities, which segue into the abstractions of language. So the metaphor is the reverse of what most people commonly assume. It doesn't depend on a capacity for abstract verbal abstraction, but rather on a physical interaction with a concrete sensuous world. So far from being a mere curiosity, synesthesia has caused a paradigm shift in two senses. For science, it illuminates a broad swath of the mind, and it forces fundamental rethinking about how brains are organized. 25 years ago, my colleagues insisted synesthesia could not be real because it contradicted theory. And today, synesthesia's reality has made theory change. The senses are not as separate as we once thought they were. Those channels are quite close. And modularity as an organizing principle is not holding up. The other sense of a paradigm shift is what synesthesia means personally, because it highlights the amazing differences in which individual people see the world subjectively. And it reminds us that each brain uniquely filters out what it perceives in the first place. Now, artists try to make a living conveying their point of view to us. But what do the rest of us do with ours? Do we conform, or do we let ourselves shine? I mean, I think it's a very optimistic message that we harbor so much multisensory potential. The circuits are there, they're just waiting to rise to consciousness. So I hope that learning a little bit about this fascinating topic of perceptual synesthesia will lead each of you to new connections in your own endeavors and to enjoying these artworks in a whole new perspective. Thank you very much.
Are there some countries or cultures that would enhance the
So far, in quite a number of countries, synesthesia is the same. The gene frequency is the same. The expression of it is the same. The different varieties are the same. So there's nothing cultural. The culture comes in very early when during this early period of brain development, there must be some learning that attaches on to these neurons, and then it stays stable for life.
So could you work with infants and increase?
Well, some of the most fascinating research on synesthesia is being done by Daphne Maurer at McMaster University. She's an intensive neonatologist, and it's very, very hard to do experiments on newborns and 3 months old, but there are some very clever work being done with that. Yes.
Somebody in the back had a question.
Do you know of any synesthetic twins?
Yes, there are synesthetic twins and synesthetic triplets. In fact, one of the most fascinating cases is the triplets, in which one of them does not have synesthesia. So it's the wonderful little exceptions like that are helping us tease out. There's a big race on in Canada, England, and the United States to find the synesthesia gene. And it's actually, I mean, here again, here's this obscure little quirk. It turns out that synesthesia is almost the perfect thing for perceptual genomics, biologic genomics, because you've got a very definite perceptual condition. Either you have it or you don't have it. It's fairly easy to phenotype that, as you can tell that people really have it or not. And it's a fairly common gene that you can find it in families and trace the gene. So it may be the first one in which you're able actually to map the gene that's responsible for some aspect of perception. That's very exciting. I can't tell you who's winning the race, though. Yes, sir.
Is there any real-time evidence in the form of nuclear magnetic resonance studies demonstrating that part of the brain lighting up?
Yes, all the PET scans, xenon inhalation, MRI, all the various technologies, the EEG, power spectrum analysis. They all show what you expect is that if you're hearing color, that the color area lights up. For example, if you're tasting shapes, if you're tasting words, you have, again, the word areas and the taste areas light up. So multiple experiments show cross-activation of different brain areas that are involved in a stimulus and a synesthetic response. Yes?
This exhibit mentions spiritual or cosmic ideas. Does that play into, can either of you discuss any of that?
I will say that synesthetes have unusual experiences more often than the baseline population does, so clairvoyance, precognitive dreams, aura. There is a kind of synesthesia that's it's the simplest kind. I first called it simple synesthesia. Basically, people see auras over the Golden Gate Bridge or around their friends and their dogs and stuff. And we now call it emotionally mediated synesthesia. And it turns out that, like, strangers, for example, won't have any color. But the closer you know somebody, the closer the emotional connection, the more intense the color goes. And that's, so affect is very key to perceptual synesthesia. We have a lot of hands. In the back, yes.
Have there been any studies of the relationship between synesthesia and perfect pitch?
Yes, actually there is. And also eidetic memory, that synesthetes, it's a similar kind of thing. Well, the similarities are very superficial. Again, it runs in families. It's an all or nothing thing. You either have it or you don't have it. It's apparent at a very early age without the need to practice or develop it. And the people with perfect pitch express this astonishment that other people don't do this. How could you not do this? It's simply why don't you see this music? I don't understand.
So, people with perfect pitch, do they have a tendency to have synesthesia?
No, not any more than others.
And they would very much disagree on, that green would be A, for instance, because everybody perceives that differently. It could be yellow. Well, we had an artist, Carol's thing is, she does letters or the sounds of letters with colors, and she has started this conference now of synesthetes. And she said the hardest thing is when you get a whole room full of them, they will not agree on what the colors are that make up the alphabet, for instance. And so it's just
Carol also had Carol's also a sculptor, and she has touch and color and shape, and particularly when she has acupuncture for her bad arthritic knee. And when the needle is being put in or removed, she says she sees this stream of shapes. She says, a year's worth of sculpture goes right by me in 2 seconds, and I just want to grab it, So.
How about on the side?
I just came back from an energy medicine conference where the person teaching it was seeing colors for around everybody, saying, oh, now you're changing from this to that, and she was talking about how the meridians and the energy moving in all the meridians have different colors and change colors. Do you know about anything?
Well, two things. One is historical, and that many ancient traditions, healing traditions, Indian especially, relate, like the Devanagari alphabet in India is colors. It's called Varnamala, which means garland of colors. So there's a long history going back thousands of years of linking these kind of two things together. To what aspect they may be describing genuine synesthesia, and to what aspect they may be idealized extrapolations, we can never say. But the other is that now that we've studied, there's been a paper, a colleague of mine in London wrote a wonderful paper about emotionally mediated synesthesia, and in it, he says, it may be that old grandmas in the woods and the witches that you went to get your aura read, that they really were synesthetic and nobody knew, and they just were doing their thing. So they didn't put a name to it. Messiaen had synesthesia work in both directions. Usually it's a one-way street, so it's sound to vision. But Messiaen, when he saw colors, he heard music, and when he heard music, he saw colors. So when he was commissioned to write Au Canyon des Étoiles, From the Canyon to the Stars, he was in Bryce Canyon, and he said, my eye went up the colored cliffs of the wall, and the music just wrote itself. So he invented that whole system of the modes of limited transposition to convey the color of the chords. And in Messiaen, Like in Hockney, for example, Hockney responds to sequence, to melody. That's what triggers color in Hockney. Now, Messiaen, it's the vertical intervals between the notes. So that's why you have all these big chord clusters in him. And that produces the color.
But he also said, for instance, he was at, I can't remember, it was an exhibit or a film, and he had to walk out because the colors and the sounds just didn't match. And like, so they would have, you know, some scene being portrayed with some kind of music, and he said, oh, it just made me ill to my stomach because it just didn't go together. And that's a very common reaction for someone with synesthesia. If it's not the same correspondence that they have, it can be like physically nauseating.
I wanted to follow up on an idea which was that neither one of us are synesthetic. But if you want to experience synesthesia, learn to meditate. Don't take LSD, because synesthesia is 10 times more common during meditative states. And the longer people meditate, the more experience they have, the more likely they are to experience synesthesia. And like adept teachers, over half of them have polymodal, multisensory experiences. And this is part of the evidence that synesthesia is widespread in the population and that it may possibly be cultivated, that it's just hovering there under the edge of consciousness. Sometimes it also has, when we are falling asleep, hypnopompic circumstances, is that you have multisensory experiences. So there's a hand in the back that just shot up.
Kids who have autism have trouble separating out stimuli. Are they synesthetes? Do they have a
No, actually, autism is almost the opposite of synesthesia in a way, that they have trouble with emotional connections, whereas synesthetes, it just comes all too easily. So no, there's not a higher incidence of synesthesia in autism, and there's not a link between them genetically.
We really want to raise his hand and say synesthete. I'd love to hear from him. He's had his hand up.
Oh yes, great.
I just want to know, are different sorts of synesthesia, like if a mother gets sound synesthesia, will her daughter have sound synesthesia, or is it just her?
Oh, yes, when it runs in families, what happens? Well, in Vladimir Nabokov, for example, Vladimir Nabokov and his son and his mother had colored hearing. He had colored hearing, and Dmitri, his son, has colored hearing. So there it all follows through, but not necessarily. So you may have colored letters and numbers in one person, and then let's say their daughters will have a different kind of synesthesia. So it doesn't, the type, the phenotype, which means the physical expression of it, does not come through genetically. It could be anything. And twins could have different kinds of synesthesia. What kind do you have?
I get colors from numbers and words, and colors and shapes for concepts.
For concepts.
Does the different senses has to happen very much at the same minute? Sometimes, for instance, if you listen to music, you think of some kind of picture, but that's a little bit go through your conscious. I think you thought about, but that's not synesthesia.
That's not synesthesia. That's imagery.
Yeah, like I have an experience. I saw a painting, a Chinese painting at National Gallery. The peonies with very abstract and very realistic both in the same painting. The moment I saw it, I feel I can smell the scent of it, but that only happened once. It never happened before, never happened after. How does that work? I mean,
oh, we could be here all night. It may have been a one-time thing.
You can come to my
So
house next
it's all
year
very
when the peonies
evanescent.
bloom.
It's all very evanescent, a one-time thing.
That's wonderful.
I don't know if I want to get into neuroethology of art, but there is a topic of neurologists writing about art and why. I mean, there's a painting, doesn't look like anything. Why do we value it? Why do we look at it? What does it do? And art is giving us a jolt of emotional recognition, and we're not conscious of it, and we either respond to it or we don't. And that those circuits can then travel in other places and stimulate other things in us. And one time it'll be one experience, and another time another. It's like memory. Memory is not like a video camera in our head where we play back things exactly as they happened. Each time we remember, it's a creative act. It's always different with each recollection. So our experiences are very fluid, very evanescent. unrepeatable.
There's another question.
It makes being alive so wonderful.
Yeah, you.
Mine is more a comment. My son just mentioned about his synesthesia. Long before we realized...
Do you have synesthesia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I wasn't the mother in question. No. But long before we realized he had it, I already thought his relationship to books was different to everyone else's. You know, he read them more intensely, he read them faster, he read them over and over. His relationship was terribly different to everyone else's. And then it made sense to me that he experienced it.
Something else is going on with the words.
So his experience is actually
I was taking some notes and you commented that synesthetes have more dreams. My daughter has synesthesia and she has a lot of nightmares. She's 16, is that connected?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, just dreams.
Well, dreams are, well, as you fall asleep, that is an occasion in which us non-synesthetes can experience synesthesia in a transition from wakefulness to sleep. It's more common to have that.
Question way over.
Yes?
Yeah, I just had a question. If people are sometimes like at a car accident and they damage part of the brain, has there been any people not previously having this condition then?
Yes, actually, yes. I wrote a paper about that, that closed head trauma can cause a temporary synesthesia, usually between sound, sight, and pain, and or sense or touch. And then there's a wonderful case, I think actually Oliver Sacks wrote about it, which a painter had synesthesia, he had an accident, he became colorblind, and he not only lost his sense of color, but he lost his synesthesia as a result of the brain injury. So there's so you can have a dissociation of the two.
And unfortunately, we've been given the signal that we
the
have
high
to
side?
leave. Yes.
They're going to lock the gallery, so unless we all want to have a pajama party. So.